and I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the slope and relative index of inequality. So, Walter just walked us through some of the work that we've been doing at HSPN, and I'm going to give a little bit of a preview of where we're heading towards in terms of equity analysis. So, as slope index of inequality, or SII, it's basically a way for us to summarize the absolute inequality gap for outcomes like ACSE hospitalizations or ED visits across the whole socioeconomic spectrum. So we're not just comparing the very top and the very bottom. We're really looking at the distribution between as well. And so how we do that is we rank each population subgroup. So as Walter mentioned, at HSPN, we're doing our analysis on the OHT ADA level from least deprived to most deprived based on material resources, previously known as material deprivation, as many of you were probably familiar with. And then we look at how does this outcome change as this deprivation increases or decreases. So the SII does come from a population-weighted regression. So larger ADAs do have more influence on the analysis. And the key thing I wanted to point out here is that the result is in the same units as the outcome. So when we're looking at something like ED visits, the SII is telling us the absolute difference in rates between the most and least deprived areas, so which makes it pretty intuitive for us to report. This is an example looking at, rates increasing. So on the x-axis, we have the deprivation quintiles that Walter was referring to. And when we go from left to right, it's increasing. And this is kind of showing us that residents that are living in the most materially deprived areas are experiencing a higher rate of this outcome. I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about the interpretation of SII and the directionality of it. So the direction of the indicator and the stratifier really determines the interpretation of the actual slope index. So for example, let's take a look at something a little bit more intuitive, for instance, like hospitalization rates. So at the bottom, where like higher rates are less favorable, right? We don't want higher rates of hospitalizations. Depending on how the equity stratifier is ranked, interpretation of the directionality changes. So if we have, let's say, if higher means more resources, so deprivation was ranked from most deprived to least deprived, then positive SII is pro-equity, which means more hospitalizations are actually happening in less deprived areas. Whereas if higher actually means less resources, so at HSPN, we've ranked our deprivation from least deprived to most deprived, then positive and significant actually means anti-equity. So more hospitalizations are actually occurring in more deprived areas. Just to go on like what these actual SIIs mean, SII of 0 means perfect equality. So that's across the board, there's no inequity across our equity stratifier. So in our case, our deprivation levels. And then a larger absolute SII means greater inequity. So whether you're going the further you are from 0, whether it's in the positive or negative direction, it just means the larger the inequity. And then moving on to what the negative and positive SIIs are. Negative SII in our case means higher rates in less deprived areas. And then a positive SII means higher rates in more deprived areas. So a negative SII, you're going to see a lot of our cancer screening indicators. A lot of our OHTs will have negative SIIs, which means that there is more cancer screening being done in less deprived neighborhoods. And then again, just to really reiterate, higher rates are going to be better or worse depending on the outcome that we're looking at. And then moving on to relative index of inequality. So this is the relative complement to the SII, and it's calculated using the same regression equation as the SII. So instead of taking the slope, we're taking the ratio between the fitted value of the most advantaged group and the least advantaged group. The RII doesn't have units, so it's not per 1,000, ED visits per 1,000 or years of life. And this makes it useful for comparing inequality across a variety of different outcomes. But when we're looking at it within a certain outcome, it can sometimes feel a little bit abstract. So that's why a lot of the times you will see the RII paired with absolute measures like the SII. In terms of interpretability, so RII of 1 means no inequity, so perfect equality. And then RII of greater than 1 is higher rates are in more deprived areas, and RII of less than 1 is higher rates in less deprived areas. Moving on to our methods. So we included all OHIP eligible patients in Ontario as of April 1st, 2023 for ACSC hospitalizations, just because we used 2 years of data due to low event rates, and then April 1st, 2024 for all of the other indicators. We also restricted analysis to indicator-specific eligible populations. This is the exact same as what we've been doing for all of these indicators in our previous reports as well. So for ACSC hospitalizations and ED visits, analysis were restricted to patients less than 75 years. And then for the cancer screening, we included screen-eligible patients within a certain age group. In terms of our equity stratifier, we use the factor scores for the material resources dimension of the 2021 on-margin index. So in terms of our geographic unit of analysis, we did use the aggregated dissemination area, again, just because a little bit of a higher level because of our rates. And then we also use 2 strategies to mitigate having unstable estimates or like super large confidence intervals. So the first thing we did was any OHT ADAs with populations below the minimum threshold to yield expected of minimum of 20 events were excluded. And then we also took it a step further and we excluded any OHTs that have fewer than 10 ADAs for our analysis. In terms of adjustments, similar to what we've been doing all this time, all rates were adjusted for age and sex as appropriate. Moving on to our first graph. So here we're looking at ACSC hospitalizations. And just to quickly orient you here, so the horizontal, that is the performance measure that you're used to seeing. So left to right is the rate of ACSC hospitalizations. And you can see there's a little bit of a 5-fold variation. So we have, low of just over 100 per 100,000 to just over 550. And with these graphs, you're always going to see the performance of the outcome left to right. And then the new thing that we're introducing moving forward is on the y-axis, you're going to see the SII. So this is what tells us how big the gap is between people living in the most and least deprived areas. So in other words, how unequal are these ACSC rates within these OHTs? When we're really looking at, which corners of the chart are maybe best or worst, the bottom left, that's kind of the worst place to be because you have lower ACSC rates overall, and then you also have, that's the best place to be. So you have lower ACSC rates overall and smaller gaps between more and less deprived communities. And then when you look at the top right, that's actually the worst place to be because you have higher rates of ACSC, but you also have larger inequities between the more and less deprived communities. And then when we're looking at the trend line, you could see that there is a clear and strong positive relationship, right? So as ACSC rates tend to increase, you can see that inequities also increasing as well. So this is telling us higher use of hospital care isn't necessarily just a volume issue. It also seems to be an underlying equity issue as well with this outcome. And then moving on to avoidable ED visits. So this is telling us a little bit of a different story. You see the mass clustering at the low ED visits and low SII right there at the bottom left. And then we also see a few outliers, right? So we see at the top, we have 3 OHTs that seem to have very large SIIs. So those OHTs, they seem to be having higher inequity with areas of higher deprivation having more use. And then on top of that, we also see there's some OHTs to the far right, where irrespective of material deprivation, they seem to be having higher rates. So when we're looking at a graph like this and you see kind of the clustering by the median and then a spread of a few OHTs, which seem to be kind of driving that trend line, here's where we can talk about perhaps some targeted initiatives for those OHTs. Moving on to cervical cancer screening. So this again is different from the previous 2 indicators that I talked about because here we want higher screening rates, right? So the optimal number here is 100%. And you can see on the x-axis, the range that we have here for cervical cancer screening across the province is between 45 and 60%. One thing I did want to direct everyone to is the median equity line, which is the horizontal dashed line, and that's below zero. So that's telling us that most OHTs have a negative SIIs. So across these OHTs, fewer people are having cervical cancer screening in areas of greater deprivation. Another interesting thing about this graph here is you can see that there isn't much variability in the y-axis. Any variability that we're seeing is kind of at that x-axis, right? And the trend line is mostly flat. It's kind of blending in with the horizontal axis. So it's showing us differences in overall cancer screening and the rates of it is not necessarily associated with deprivation related inequity. So there may be other factors playing at play here. Looking at breast cancer screening, so this is telling a slightly different story than our cervical cancer screening. So whereas PAP was kind of clustered at the median, here you could see OHTs are more spread out. And then when you look at in terms of like the quadrants, here the top right here is actually the best place to be because we want higher rates of screening. And then the top right is SIIs are actually closer to zero. So the smaller gap between most and least deprived areas, it's kind of closing, right? And then bottom left is actually the worst place to be. Similarly to PAP, you can see the median equity. So the horizontal dashed line that is well below zero, right? A lot of OHTs are having negative SII. So that again is telling us that lower screening rates are happening in areas with higher deprivation. And PAP was a very much a flat line, but you could see here there's a little bit of a shallow trend line, which shows a modest association between overall screening levels and inequity. Moving on to our last screening, cancer screening, colorectal cancer screening. Very similar story here. All but two OHTs have negative SIIs. So it tells us that, again, across most OHTs, there's less colonoscopy cancer screening happening in areas of greater deprivation. And again, the slight flat to shallow trend line shows us that there is a little bit of association between overall screening levels and inequity. But even with the higher rates of colonoscopy cancer screening, OHTs are with lower screening are still happening in deprived communities. Moving on to our last indicator, our last new indicator I will introduce, percent not rostered. So again, here our performance outcome is on the x-axis. So the higher rates here are the worst outcome. And then our SII is on the y-axis. So this graph here is showing us OHTs with higher percentage of patients not rostered are having higher inequity, right? Even though most do cluster around that median. What's interesting here, there are actually a few OHTs, I think it's 11 in total, that have negative SII. So there are some OHTs that seem to have worse attachment in less deprived areas. But overall, the positive trend line shows that OHTs with poorer overall attachment also tend to have larger gaps between the more and less deprived communities. Okay, we spent a lot of time talking about the SII, so I just wanted to spend a few moments talking about the RII. So as I mentioned, the RII is the relative component. So it takes the ratio of the SII, and RII of 1 is perfect equality. And then when you get further away from 1, it's higher inequity. So here you're looking at the left-hand side is the graph that you've seen before. It's the SII versus the adjusted ACSC hospitalization rates. And then on the right-hand side, we have the RII component to it. So RII versus ACSC hospitalization rates. And you can see here, both of these measures tend to show that higher ACSC rates are generally associated with more inequity. But when we look at the RII in particular, you can see there's a lot more clustering, right? So this is showing us many OHTs, they may have very similar relative inequity, even though maybe their overall hospitalization rates may be quite different. So they may have different, their absolute inequity might be a little bit larger, but their relative inequity might be a little bit more similar across these OHTs. And then I'm just going to end off talking about one more example. So the top there, that's the ACSC hospitalization rates that you've seen. I've just kind of layered on another indicator just to quickly chat about it. So this is the percent not rostered patients. Again, the left-hand side is the SII graph, and then the right-hand side is the RII graph. And you could see here, very similar trends you can see at the SII and the RII. If you just want to quickly look at the interpretation, the slightly different interpretation. So for the SII, the dashed median equity line is just around 9%. So that's telling us there's about a 9% difference in the share of people that are not rostered between the most and least deprived areas. And then when we look at the RII, the interpretation is slightly different because we're looking at it relatively. So we're saying, relatively speaking, people in more deprived areas are about 40% more likely to be not rostered because the RII is about 1.4 in terms of median equity. And we can also say that the proportional gap is fairly consistent across the teams just because of all the clustering that's happening across that median rate and median equity. Just some final thoughts here. So what we found with these SII and RAI analysis was ACSC hospitalization and attachment to primary care rostered do show a strong relationship with material deprivation. And then we found weak association. So cancer screening did have a range of OHTs where you could see some OHTs did have some equity gaps. Some were even equity positive, right? So lower SES actually had higher achievement in some of these cancer screening outcomes. And then we found that ED visits were equivocal. That's everything for me.